Hello, good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, and good night, whenever this reaches you. My name is Maria Kvilhaug, and I am a Norwegian historian and writer who mostly write in English. Those of you who have followed my work before will know that I mostly concentrate on my particular academic field, which is Old Norse mythology and pre-Christian culture and religion, mainly that of the Viking Age of Scandinavia. Now, by Scandinavia, I am referring to my own country, Norway, as well as Sweden and Denmark. These are the countries today in which people before spoke the Old Norse language and worshipped the Old Norse gods, and that they did until about 900 years ago. We may refer to them as Norsemen, and they were basically Norwegians, Danes and Swedes, although many of them moved into other lands. The Old Norse language and religion belong to the same family as those that were still found among Saxons and Frisians at the start of the Viking Age, and it is a family we may refer to as Germanic. Before they became Christians, Anglo-Saxons and Franks also belonged to this category of people who were connected through language and a common origin and similar religion forms. As you can see on this map here, the Germanic language and religion family was surrounded by Finno-Ugric, Celtic, Slavic and Baltic peoples. The Celtic, Slavic and Baltic peoples shared a very ancient common origin with the Germanic peoples when it comes to language and cultural traits. And that family, larger, more ancient family, is the one we usually think of as Indo-European, although they, of course, never call themselves that. The Indo-European language family would also include the Latin and the Greek languages, and but the Finno-Ugric family, however, belongs to an entirely different language family with age-old origins of their own. By the Viking Age, I am referring to an era of piracy where Scandinavians joined the pirate hordes of Europe that kept harassing the shores of other people at the time. And this era is often confused with the pagan religion of the Scandinavians. But the truth is that piracy continued more than a century after the conversion to Christianity, and piracy, that is going a Viking, was practiced by Christians and heathens alike. During the Viking Age, Norsemen spread and settled into other lands such as Russia, Ireland, England. But in these countries, they blended into the native populations very soon. But they also settled in previously quite empty lands, such as Iceland and what they often refer to as the Western Islands, such as Orkney and the Faroe Islands. And today, people still actually speak a form of Old Norse in Iceland, Orkney and the Faroe Islands. Now, the Viking Age, as in the era of Viking raids, ended 900 years ago, which is a good 100 years after the conversion to Christianity. The Viking Age began 400 years before that, which means that the era of Scandinavian piracy abroad was but a short time, actually, in the general history of Scandinavia and its Old Norse culture. And that culture reached back much, much further, another 1,000 years at least. Now, the very first mention of Norse people with a clearly Norse culture is found in Roman sources. And these sources date back to the 2nd century before Christ. And these sources describe tribes such as the Cimbri and the Teutons, who apparently came out of Jutland which is the northern peninsula of the European continent, which is a part of Denmark. Now, these people met with and fought with the Romans, and they left quite an impression on them. They were described as culturally quite similar to the Celtic peoples that the Romans met, but they spoke a different language. Now, even hundreds of years before that, when Scandinavia was still in the Bronze Age, there are some Greek sources describing how Scandinavian pilgrims came all the way down to Greece to worship and serve at the temple of the goddess Artemis at the island of Delos. So it's an old culture, actually, an old culture which lasted a long time before the Viking Age. Now, and when studying the Norse myths, it becomes evident that these myths constitute a culmination of several different and very ancient traditions that little by little, over time, merged together to form a native cultural system in its own right. And that would be the one we refer to as Old Norse. I would like to take some time to discuss some of these ancient roots. And today I want to begin with those roots that must be the most ancient of them all. So, as I looked back at my studies, I decided that there are 3 main roots to Old Norse myths that must constitute the very oldest of roots. So old that they are shared by many other mythologies in the world. The first root, I think, is the very notion of a world, a reality, where several different human-like creatures existed side by side. Because in Norse myths, like in many other myths, mythologies of the world, but in Norse myths we have humans, we have dwarves, we have elves, giants, trolls, thyrses, you name it. They occupy the same worlds. They travel to visit each other. Sometimes they are at war, but more often they actually seek each other out for counsel, for cooperation, for trade, for friendship, for sex, and even for marriage. And sometimes they adopt each other. So there are 2 tribes of gods. Once they were at war with each other, the Aesir and the Vanir. Then they became allies. And the gods have absolutely no qualms at all about marrying women of elfish or human or giant origins. And goddesses even accept sex with dwarfs. So this sort of alternative mythical reality is quite common. And I cannot help but wonder if this age-old and deeply rooted idea of a multi-species world full of cross-species relationships may actually have its origin in a time when such a world was an actual physical reality. I'm not saying that the different powers of Norse myths were that they actually represent, say, Neanderthals, because obviously the Norse people would not have any idea who the Neanderthals were. So they're not telling stories about Neanderthals. That's not what I'm saying. No, but I'm saying that the concept of a world with many different human-like creatures interacting with each other and intermarrying with each other, that this concept itself may actually be a result of surviving memories, perhaps stories transmitted over vast stretches of time, stories rooted in an era where a multi-species world was actually the order of the day. Yeah. The second root, I think, is shamanism. Shamanism is an academic term. It was developed mainly by ethnographers and anthropologists, and it was developed to describe a certain form of practice that appears to have been common among almost all ancient tribal communities. It is a practice that is usually centered around a person, male or female, and this person acts as an intermediary between the people and the spirits and the gods. And maybe they represent the earliest sort of priests and priestesses before there were any organized religion or any organized priesthoods. The shaman would use drums, rattles, staffs, singing, or other techniques to make a rhythm that served to induce a state of trance. And in this state of trance, the shaman would be, at least they thought, the shaman would be able to invoke and contact spirits and even gods in order to ask for advice, for help, for guidance, for healing and protection. The shaman would also know the art of lucid dreaming and what we often refer to today as astral traveling, that is traveling outside the body and into other worlds, or traveling in the shape of an animal, for example. Since forms of shamanism is found all over the world, it is most likely extremely ancient. It probably reaches back into the earliest eras of humankind. In the northern hemisphere of the world, shamanism evolved on these endless tundras and steppes of the last ice age. And from Scandinavia to Siberia to North America and Greenland, we find forms of shamanism that appear to be strongly related to each other. Shamanism runs like a deep, ever-present, very powerful undercurrent in Norse myths. The two most dominating gods, Odin and Freya, they both appear to be practicing forms of shamanism. And forms of shamanism were practiced among the Norse people. And when shamanism was outlawed by the church, Norse people actually went to seek out Sami shamans instead, because they continued to practice shamanism. And among the Sami, shamanism has been practiced even until the present day. In Norse myths, we hear of Odin, whose body could lay still as if sleeping, while his soul traveled in the shape of animals to find out what was happening in the world. And he could invoke the spirits of the dead and other supernatural beings in order to ask for information, for example. From Norse sagas, we hear of women who could sing until guardian spirits arrived and could tell them the fate of the people. And maybe they could sing also until all the fish came into the bay and into the nets of hungry people. So the third route, I think, that is very, very ancient is ancestral mother worship and earth mother worship. I say these things together because they seem to overlap somehow. Because, yeah, despite having become a more or less patriarchal society by the time of the Viking Age, Norsemen still worshipped their ancestral mothers, and these were the legendary mothers of their clans and their tribes, who were worshipped like goddesses and who were likened to the Earth Mother. And even as they followed the father lines, or had begun to follow the father lines, each dynasty or tribe actually began with an ancestral mother. According to Snorri, the pagan Norsemen believed that the earth was alive and that she was sentient and powerful, and that she raised all life and took all life back into herself, and that she was immensely powerful and ancient. And for this reason, he concluded, they regarded her as the most ancient ancestor, and they counted their lineages all the way back to her. And during the Iron Age, Norsemen, Germans and Celts alike raised countless altars to the ancestral mothers of their tribes and their clans. And they inscribed these altars with Latin letters, which allows us to know who these mothers were. Sometimes they are called mothers, as in Latin, matrona. And sometimes they are called goddesses, in Latin, dei. And sometimes their collective powers are presented as one single goddess. But the ancestral mother worship seems to be at the base of their religion. The kings, Norse kings, they had to ritually marry the ancestral mother of the tribe in order to legitimize their rule. So these Norse Germanic ancestral mothers were mainly responsible for providing for the needs of their descendants, for protecting them, for guiding them through life, and for influencing their fates. Yeah. One of the most famous ancestral mothers described in Old Norse myths, in Old Norse sources, is Thorgerd Holgabrud. She had a temple of her own, with a wooden statue of her and of her sister, and she received sacrifice and adoration by her descendants until the end of the pagan religion era in Norway. And she was considered to be the mother of the Kvilhaug people of northern Norway, the people who lived in Lofoten. I believe this ancestral mother worship also constitutes one of the oldest roots to Norse religion, beginning way back in the Ice Age of Europe, because, well, similar beliefs in ancestral mothers have been recorded by ethnographers among the Siberian tribes these tribes that until very recently, and even some of them into the present day, lived exactly like the people their ancestors had lived during the Ice Age. Yeah, these ethnographers they observed that the people were worshipping ancestral mothers, and these mothers were associated with the very oldest of ancestral mothers, namely the Earth Mother. And they carved images of her, a naked woman figure, which would seem pregnant, very voluptuous, and they carved images of her that were made to be stuck into the ground for protection, for guidance, and for ensuring provisions and game. So this is a practice that has been observed in modern times among people in Siberia who lived more or less exactly like people did back in the Ice Age. And if we do look back into the Ice Age, we find that thousands of figurines just like that, so-called Venus figurines, they have been found all over the Eurasian continent, and especially in Europe actually, made to be stuck into the ground by their feet. And this tradition is at least 50,000 years old. It is known that many Siberian tribes, especially the Uralic ones, carry a significant percentage of genetic ancestry that link them to the very first humans who lived in Europe during the last Ice Age. The same is the case with the Sami people of Scandinavia. They carry as much as 50% of DNA from the earliest Ice Age Europeans. So, yeah. Even the general population of Northern Europe carries a relatively high percentage of genetic ancestry with Ice Age people, even if our origins are more diverse and blended out and mixed with later inputs. All in all, I have identified at least 3 deeply rooted cultural traditions that not only have survived, which were very much alive and vibrant, even in the religion of Viking Age Scandinavians. And these roots, these elements of culture, they can be traced all the way back to the last Ice Age, which is why I have decided to discuss and present the history of the very first peoples who lived in Europe today. To begin with, I would like you all to contemplate the time scales here. The Old Norse culture of Scandinavia that gave rise to Old Norse mythology was gone 800 years ago. In those 800 years, we have seen the Middle Ages, the Protestant conversions, the Enlightenment period, the French Revolution, the Industrial Age, the inventions of electricity, 2 world wars, the rise of the modern world as we know it today, the internet, our smartphones, our digital world, all this which we now take completely for granted, has hardly even existed for more than 20 years. So 800 years is a long time. And before that, in Scandinavia, there was the Viking Age, lasting only 400 years. Before that, while Europe went through its dark ages, Scandinavia was still in the Iron Age, which began only 2000 years ago. And that was when the Roman Empire knew a cultural peak. And the Roman Empire ruled the entire Mediterranean world, Southern Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. They were all part of the same empire 2000 years ago. And they were constituted a cultural melting pot that totally changed the world back then. So we're speaking 2000 years ago. And if you move back just another 1000 years, we have the Bronze Ages, ancient Egypt, the Minoan Empire in Crete, the Vedic civilization in India, the first Chinese empire. Go back another 1000 years and we in Scandinavia had hardly moved out of the Stone Age, while the Sumerian civilization flourished down in the Levant. So another 1000 years and we enter the megalithic age, and we still have some 5000 years before we reach the beginning of Scandinavian prehistory, when hunter-gatherers of the tundras first began to follow the reindeer herds into the new world that had emerged from beneath the ice caps. So if we only move back to 10,000 years before Christ, there was no Scandinavia. 12,000 years ago, no Scandinavia. There was no Northern Europe. It was all covered by ice, and it had been covered by ice for 100,000 years. We are speaking of immense stretches of time here. So, yeah, our story begins way, way back in time, a long, long time before there was any Northern Europe. And this was a long, long time before there were any Norse people at all. It was a long, long time before there were any Indo-Europeans, a long time before there were any of the ethnic groups and languages that we today take for granted as a part of our history. It was a long time before there were any national borders that we know of, and a long time before people even knew the concept of continents and countries, national borders. None of that existed. And I suppose you have all heard of ice ages. The last ice age ended only 12,000 years ago. And only then did people begin to move into Scandinavia and the rest of Northern Europe. And if you can hardly imagine how different the world was just 10,000 years ago, imagine going back to a time even before that. You see, the Ice Age started an even longer time before. It started 100,000 years ago before that. Actually, it started 110,000 years ago from now. So if we are to look at the time before the last ice age, we are going to have to begin our story before 110,000 years ago, before the last ice age began. So let us have a look at this map. Now, when you look at this map, some of you are going to be a bit surprised because it doesn't show Europe and Africa in the center or America to the west. But this is how the map usually looks like to people who live in Asia or Australia, for example. We all like to place ourselves in the center. Of course, if we go west from Europe, we will end up on the east coast of America. That is the nature of the globe. But this map is actually better than the Euro-centered one because it also offers a great opportunity to understand the movements of people geographically by showing how the continents actually hang together and how people could have moved in the past. Now, if you look at this map, you will see that Europe and Asia is actually one single continent, geographically speaking. This is why we call it Eurasia. However, up in the north, we have a mountain range called the Urals. Further south, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, we have another mountain range called the Caucasus. Back in the Ice Age, the Caspian Sea was 3 times as big as it is today. And together with these two large seas, these two mountain ranges create a natural barrier between what we call Europe and what we call Asia. So when people first moved into Europe, they would have come from Western Asia through the tundras to the north of the Black Sea, between the Urals and the Caucasus. Or they would come from the Middle East through Anatolia, which is now Turkey. For millions of years already, human-like creatures had roamed the earth. We actually know very little about them. And the further back we go, the less we really know. You see, there have been ice ages, for example. And as said, for 100,000 years, all of northern Europe was hidden beneath large ice caps. And with those ice caps disappeared 10,000 years ago, there was hardly a trace of anything that had been going on before the ice came. So all evidence for human or hominid activity prior to the Ice Age was plain gone. And adding to ice caps, there have been sinking and rising sea levels, there have been volcanic eruptions, there have been supervolcanic eruptions, and other dramatic climate changes that have wiped out most of what we know about our past. All we have left are pieces of stone tools, fossilized excrements, and pieces of bones and skulls. And modern DNA science has also offered up more details from our ancestors, from their lives, as to where they lived. The few skulls that we have found give us a fairly good idea. For millions of years, many different sorts of hominids lived on the continents of Eurasia and Africa. And by hominid, I am referring to our older cousins, the people who were like us, but different when it came to their skulls and the shapes of their brains. As far as I know, there is no evidence for hominids ever living in America or Australia. That only by the era of our own species, the Homo sapiens, do we seem to have moved into more continents than these. However, a lot of evidence has vanished with time and with climatic upheavals. And very recently, there was discovered a site in America that must have been 200,000 years old. And the site has sadly not yielded any human or hominid remains, so only tools and fireplaces. So they could have been any sort of human or hominid. We simply do not know what sort of human species had been using this American site back then, or how many they were. There is no trace of these people in the genetic records of Native Americans either, so these people probably went extinct. But anyway, by the start of the last ice age, now we're talking about 110,000 years ago, the start of the last ice age. Many kinds of hominids had vanished, and actually 110,000 years ago, I don't think we have found any more evidence for hominids in Africa, for example. They only found human skulls. So it appears that African hominids had sort of been replaced by members of our own species, the Homo sapiens. But Neanderthals evidently ruled supreme on the entire European and West Asian continent for hundreds of thousands of years. And they had a more eastern cousin, the Denisovian, as well as some more archaic forms of human known as Homo erectus, which still appear to have dwelled in East Asia. About human evidence for Homo sapiens. As said, we find different sorts of hominids all over Eurasia and Africa. By the time of the last ice age, 110,000 years ago, the number of hominid skulls had already dwindled. But we find remains of Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia. We find remains of Denisovians in East Asia, and we also found some remaining Homo erectus also in Eastern Asia. In Africa, however, the hominid population vanished, and by 300,000 years ago, we find the oldest remains of our own species in what is today Morocco. And by 200,000 years ago, we start to find a lot of evidence for our own species, the Homo sapiens, having spread out on the African continent. But we do not find we have as yet no evidence at all for our own species outside of Africa before 100,000 years ago. So we don't know if Homo sapiens had moved outside of Africa by then. There is no evidence for it. However, 100,000 years ago, we do find evidence for our species, Homo sapiens, living in the Middle East. Side by side with Neanderthals, who also lived there. So, but that is, I think we only have one site where we have evidence for that. And only from about 70,000 years ago do we start to find a lot of evidence for our own species moving about the rest of the world. So yeah, this is based on the actual evidence that we have. For the time being, all finds of skulls belonging to our own species of human from before the last ice age have been found in Africa. And yeah, so if our particular form of human, with our particular form of foreheads, you know, what separates us from the other hominids is that we have this high forehead. Well, if any of us existed anywhere else in the world before that, we have no trace of them, simply as that. Then, sometime during the last ice age, our species begin to appear just about everywhere. And something had evidently happened. So, yeah. It has recently been discovered that the genetic record of Neanderthals actually show that they had mated with Homo sapiens women a long time before we have any fossil evidence for our existence outside of Africa. So somehow they had met up, and how and where and when that happened and to what extent nobody knows. There is a lot we do not know. But there must have been some interaction between our species and Neanderthals going way, way back in time. Yeah. Also, about Northern Europe. Northern Europe obviously existed before the last ice age, when it was not covered with ice yet. So it is entirely possible that some sort of human had lived up here in Northern Europe before the last ice age. Because, well, after all, we know that Neanderthals lived in Europe for several hundred thousands of years. Which means that they were here a long time before the last ice age. And from DNA studies, we know also that some of the Neanderthals had very pale skin and red or blonde hair and blue eyes and freckles. So, and I have to say this was very unusual. The default setting for any sort of hominids seems to have been brown to black hair, brown to green eyes, and more or less tan skin tones. So the fact that the Neanderthals developed a lighter color palette than the norm for hominids means that they were likely living far to the north for a very long time, much longer than any modern humans seem to have. Because unlike us, they had even developed bodies that were better adapted to cold climate than we ever have. And their bodies were better adapted to digest meat than we are. And it actually takes a very, very, very long time to change so radically from a previous human mold. And one of the main reasons why we Northern Europeans tend to have a very light-haired, light-eyed and light-skinned palette and heavier body types is because we inherited it from Neanderthals. Now that argument may seem funny when we realize that there are lots of other darker people who have just as much Neanderthal DNA as we do. Native Americans, for example, have just as, well, their percentage of Neanderthal DNA is just as high as it is in Europeans. And you have to remember that Neanderthals actually came in many colors, and our European ancestors may have mated more with a lighter variety. However, the first Europeans were pretty dark-haired for tens of thousands of years, so this Neanderthal palette did not really surface in our species at once, even if we had mated with them. However, the genetic makeup for lighter colors in hair and eye and skin must have started to reappear more and more as our ancestors spent generation after generation after generation in lands with less sunlight than in other places. And that is the nature of genetic ancestry. Many genes may lay dormant for generations, thousands and thousands of years. Your genes for this color, any physical trait may lay dormant for thousands of years, and it may only start to resurface in distant descendants because the climate where they lived make that sort of genetic makeup more favorable, and obviously our skins became lighter because we needed more sunlight because there was less of it. Yeah. So we are back to time just before the last ice age, when many different sort of human-like creatures roamed the world and interacted with each other, just like they do in the myths, traded, adopted each other, married each other, made friends and allies, and yeah, maybe they did that more than they did war, The other hominids died out eventually, but it has become more and more apparent that this was due to climate changes and not so much to our own species, because on the contrary, these hominids actually survived into our own genetic pools. I said nobody knew anything about the national borders or continents that we take for granted today. All there was that mountain over there, the next valley, that river, this forest, that desert, those ice sheets. Life was good in many ways. Nature offered incredible riches, and there was a lot of space. And with exceptions of climate change eras, food was plentiful. So all the people who lived back then lived pretty much the same way. They hunted, they fished, they gathered, they made tools out of bone and wood and stone. They made fires, they painted their bodies, they moved about like nomads, they made houses and clothing out of the material that nature offered wherever they were, and depending on what sort of needs they had to protect themselves against weather and animals. So they had enough to eat, more than enough space. So it should not really come as a big surprise that when they met other people, they were as happy as anyone will be when they have only seen the same faces over and over again for years. Because the genetic record is indisputable. These people mated with the people they met. All the people they met, even if they were not strictly of the same species. Yeah, for a long time, we believed that our ancient cousins, the Neanderthals and the Homo erectus, that they were all brutish beasts looking like rugged ape-like humans. But now we know better. Our species, the Homo sapiens, we were still in the Stone Age. We led similar lives to the Neanderthals and the Denisovians. We had exactly the same needs. We had the same surroundings to work with. Our hominid cousins who shared our world for hundreds of thousands of years, they were quite as advanced as we were back then. Even their brain capacities were more or less on our levels, even if their brains may have worked a little differently. For example, the Neanderthal, they had a brain which was just as big as ours, sometimes even bigger, but it was shaped a little differently, and from the way it was shaped, like with a lot of more space to the back of the head, they probably had better memory and better eyesight than we have. Might even have had night vision. But they were possibly a bit slower when it came to innovation and imagination, which is associated with the frontal lobes here. I want to present this amazing graphic novel by Emmanuel Rodier. I think nobody has made a better job out of picturing the Neanderthals as they must have been, as people with a culture. So I just want to let you look at some of the images that he drew of Neanderthals looking much more like human beings than than we usually see them represented in movies and documentaries and stuff. It's amazing. Yeah. Conclusively, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo erectus were similar enough to our ancestors to be considered perfectly fine mates. So we know that there was interaction going on way back in time. Ancient Neanderthal DNA show that there was breeding between Neanderthal and Homo sapiens even before a species is thought to have entered Europe. But we do not know to what degree these people interacted with each other prior to the last ice age because, as I said, most of the evidence has vanished beneath ice sheets, tundras, and deserts, and sea levels that were different from anything we know today. But the songs and stories from a world where there were many different sorts of people, they kept echoing through the generations and became mythical worlds full of supernatural yet human-like creatures, so like us that we could mate with them. And then the last ice age began. 100,000 years ago, the entire world changed, especially for the Neanderthals and the Homo erectus and the Denisovans. Half their world froze and became inhabitable. Lush forests became endless dry tundra. The world became drier and huge deserts grew. Their populations dwindled. What about us, Homo sapiens? Well, Africa also became drier and a huge desert grew. So maybe our population also dwindled, but we did somewhat better than our cousins. But there were harsh times, and as if an ice age was not enough, 75,000 years ago there was a huge supervolcanic eruption that took place in Indonesia, affecting the whole world and the climate radically, and it had the added effect of almost wiping out both Neanderthals and Homo erectus and Denisovans. It is estimated that of our own species, the Homo sapiens, less than 10,000 individuals survived this cataclysm. Imagine that. We were almost wiped out. Our fascination for cataclysms and near extinction events, of being the last people in a world that was nearly empty, that is not taken out of the blue. We are all descended from survivors of near extinction events. All people who live today are descended from these survivors. Less than 10,000 people, maybe as little as 2,000 people, who lived 75,000 years ago. There may have been a lot more of us. Maybe we were spread out more than we know about. But back then, only a few of us had survived. And most of these people, our common ancestors, the survivors, most of these people lived, we know, in East Africa, where the climate remained habitable and where our ancestors could thrive in an otherwise suddenly very hostile world. It took 5,000 years to normalize the climate. And by then, our ancestors, the survivors, the descendants of these survivors, had started to spread out across the globe. And as we moved about, we met up with surviving groups of Neanderthals and Erectus and Denisovans, and even as these people slowly went extinct, their genetic material survived in our gene pools. All people who descend from people who lived beyond to the north of the Sahara at this time carry between 2 and 4% of their genes. So, let us fast forward to 50,000 years ago, a time when the first Homo sapiens entered Europe in large numbers, there to both blend with and replace the dwindling native Neanderthal population. 50,000 years ago, all of northern Europe was covered with ice sheets, and it had been covered with ice sheets for 50,000 years already. And Central Eurasia consisted of endless tundra. This was home to great herds of grazers, such as the reindeer, bison, mammoth, Muscus ox, aurochs, antelopes. Here are some images of tundra landscape, which is still found in Alaska, Siberia, Greenland, and the northern parts of Scandinavia. To the south of the tundra belt, there are great steppes full of horse, deer, and other beasts of the endless grasslands. Even further to the south, like in southern Europe, there were lush forests, green valleys, and coastlines full of fish, seal, and whale. There were really three types of human and slash hominid culture back then. The Ice Age people of the tundras lived very much like the tribes that were still found in Siberia and Greenland and northern Scandinavia until very recently. I believe there are still a few tribes who still live by the old ways, especially in Siberia. Nomadic and semi-nomadic reindeer hunters and reindeer herders, dressed in fur and leather, living in tents. Other people dwelled on the great steppes to the south of the tundra, hunting the flocks of horse, deer, aurochs, and other beasts of the endless grasslands. And other people again lived in the lush forests and green valleys, often by the coast, where they could also fish and hunt for seals. And as they moved about, generation after generation, seeking a little further, some of the tundra and the steppe dwellers moved west between the Ural and the Caucasus Mountains, north of the Black Sea, and kept moving for generations until they had populated the tundras and the steppes of Eastern and Central Europe, and they kept moving all the way to the western coasts of France. People who lived by the coasts and the forests of the Levant, the Middle East, they moved likewise generation after generation through Anatolia into what we today know as Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, Italy, and Spain, until they had settled the whole of southern Europe. They came in different waves, but they all came from Western Asia, and they all carried with them the same genetic ancestry, which, through the mother line, belonged to the mitochondrial DNA haplogroup U. Yes, DNA studies confirms the archaeological records. All tested skeletons from these ancient European sites show that most of our first European ancestral mothers carried the mitochondrial DNA which we know as U, earlier found only in the Middle East and Central to Western Asia. Now, we picture countless different tribes, of course, as they began to settle more permanently, or semi-permanently, in Europe. And as they settled around in Europe, they interacted with each other so much so that they developed a distinct culture of their own, the very first European culture of Homo sapiens that we know about. It is called the Aurignacian culture, and it had its peak between 47,000 and 40,000 years ago. The Aurignacian is the very first non-Neanderthal European culture that we know of. There is no earlier evidence for Homo sapiens culture in Europe, and it reached a cultural peak around 45,000 years ago. However, it lasted for about 20,000 years, from 50,000 years ago until 30,000 years ago. Now, despite the fact that the Aurignacians must have been three sorts of people, those are the tundras, those are the steppes, and those are the forests and the coasts, we can still speak of a culture because they use the same tools, the same symbolic language, the same art, the same technology. And Aurignacian sites have been found from France in the west to the northern part of the Black Sea in the east. The people live both as nomads on the tundra and in more permanent sites in the forests and valleys and caves of southern Europe. The settlements were connected through trade routes and shared hunting grounds, And there is evidence for various small groups of people regularly meeting up in large intertribal gatherings, to which they would spend months traveling. Now, the earliest, oldest example of figurative art depicting a human body that we have is the 42,000-year-old so-called Venus of Hohlefels, which was found in Germany together with one of the earliest known musical instruments, a flute, and these belong to the Aurignacian culture. In Germany was also found the 40,000-year-old Löwenmensch, literally meaning the lion human, a statue of a human, and as to gender of this statue of the human, there have been a bit of discussion because there are very few figurines showing males. So when this was found, people sort of assumed that it would have been a female because we didn't really know of any figurines presenting men. So it's very rare, but this does appear to be the figure of a male body, perhaps, and it had the head of a lion. Now, some people say that this is a head of a lioness because it lacks a mane, and that's possible. But it could also be a maneless European lion because they had lions in Europe at the time, and they didn't have so much mane as they have in Africa. So, well, it could be one of the very, very few depictions of a male figure, and yeah, it actually looks a lot like the later Egyptian figurines of the goddess Sekhmet, who had a lioness head. But yeah, so maybe the idea of gods and goddesses with human bodies and animal heads are very ancient and widespread symbols, but it is most likely a representation of a shaman who shifts shape in some way, maybe taking on the mind of a lion or a lioness, and perhaps it's a depiction of a shaman who is dressing up for ritual. These first Europeans had similar origins as the genetic records show, and they also shared a culture despite being both nomadic and widely dispersed. So it is very likely that they also shared both language and religious beliefs. So, central to their symbolic art are the very naturalistic depictions of animals and women. Men are somewhat less present in art, except as stick figures depicting multitudes or groups of hunters, or in a few cases of shape-shifter shaman images such as the lion or lioness man, or in this image from the cave of Trois Frères in France. And pardon me my French, I don't know how to pronounce it, but yeah. Anyway, this image is thought to represent a shaman changing shape into an animal, or perhaps dressed in a ritual costume, typical of shamans worldwide. Now, the Aurignacians in France were responsible for the famous cave art of Chauvet and Trois Frères. And there have been some researchers who have tried to prove quite convincingly that this cave art may not just be about hunting magic as people often believed for a long time. They have suggested that maybe these images actually represent an early form of astronomy. And astronomy in ancient times were very much like astrology, and the animals may represent astronomical constellations. And these images of the caves were repainted by descendants for thousands and thousands of years, and it appears that the small changes applied over time may reflect changes in the night skies. But anyway, just imagine this. Somebody way back in time went into these caves carrying oil lamps that they had actually invented even back then, and they painted this amazing art on the walls and on the ceilings. They even made sculptures inside these caves, and And then their descendants came and returned every year for thousands and thousands of years to repaint and restore these ancient images. So maybe these caves were something like very, very ancient forms of temples to these people. As to culture, it is very hard to say that much, but grave contents show that there was no significant hierarchy among them. Men and women and children are all buried as equally valid individuals. There is little evidence for any significant division of labor. It appears that everybody were expected to partake and contribute in whatever way they could. They all carried with them some gear for hunting and for gathering, as well as needles, fish hooks, amulets. It is very likely that men may have hunted on a larger scale than women. And if they did worship a human-like deity, then that deity may, well, it's most likely, most likely it was a sort of goddess or ancestral mother. For with the exception of the lion man, the only figurines representing people are feminine, and they do appear to represent pregnant or birthing women, and they also appear to have had an important iconic and magical function. And as I mentioned earlier, ethnographic reports from Siberia in recent times show that Siberian hunter-gatherers who still led a lifestyle similar to that of the Aurignacians of Europe show that similar fat woman statues represented the Earth Mother or else an ancestral mother, and that she would be used as a guardian of the hearth if the people had to leave their homes for a while. For example, that figurine of the Earth Mother would literally be dug into the ground so that she could stand, and there she would guard the premises. So the Ice Age figurines of such women also have a sort of stand for feet, which could easily have been dug into the ground to leave her standing there. Now, also, there are no signs of organized warfare at all. So we may say with some certainty that large-scale warfare, as we know it, was not known to these people. And maybe they really didn't have any other people to wage war with. So yeah, but the Aurignacians who lived further to the east, they did come into contact with other culture groups, and there are no signs of warfare between these either. So life was rich and good. Skeleton finds show that these people were actually healthy and well fed, and that they had better teeth than any of us who live today. So maybe warfare was completely meaningless to people who hardly owned anything, who had more than enough food, and who moved so freely across the steppes and the tundras, never settling in one place, and who regarded their neighbors as relatives with whom they could travel and marry. Yeah. The Aurignacian culture flourished for incredible 20,000 years. It had a peak of art and technology and numbers of people spread everywhere, which happened from around 47,000 years ago. And again, I want you to contemplate the time scales here. 2,000 years ago, 2000, we had the Roman Empire. And after that, we have seen age after age, culture after culture, religion shifts, paradigm shifts, all in 2,000 years. But these people here, they flourished as one uninterrupted culture for 20,000 years. Hardly any sign of any significant changes in 20,000 years. And it seems that their lives were good, actually. Now, after 20,000 years of knowing a veritable Stone Age society, calling it a civilization, maybe to push it a little, since they had no cities. But it was a society that spread from Spain and France in the west to the Black Sea and the Ural Mountains in the east. Now, from about 35,000 years ago, this tight-knitted society gradually sort of dispersed, disintegrated, the cultural peak was going down. The Aurignacian people were still there, but there was a period of slightly less concentrated art production, and it is possible that distinct groups lived separately from each other for so many generations that they actually became different tribes, and that they maybe they developed different languages, different customs even. So this tight-knit culture that had lasted for quite a while probably disintegrated a bit. And the genetic record actually shows us that the Aurignacian people did move and became very, very different ethnic groups. So how do we know this? Why? The Aurignacian people, they had all belonged to this main mitochondrial haplogroup U. And while they stayed in Europe, especially in Western Europe, 3 new subclaves of this group had emerged as a result of long-time isolation from other people. So by the time of the Aurignacian cultural peak, it seems that all the skeletons we have found from them were now children of this mtDNA haplogroup U4 or U5 and U2E. And these 3 haplogroups are subclaves of the U haplogroup that originated in Europe only. So these are the original European mother lines, basically, U4, U5, and U2E. Now, when comparing these ancient finds to modern DNA studies, the results have shown us something really, really interesting, because these first Europeans of the Ice Age, these who lived in the lands that today are known to us as France, Germany, Italy, Greece, Hungary, Bulgaria, Ukraine, Romania, these who were the first to create this famous cave art, they are not the direct ancestors of most Europeans today. We all carry a small percentage of their genetic material, but very few of us can count our direct lineages back to these first Europeans. Today, Europeans descend from much, much more diverse and varied genetic lineages, and this is because of several migration waves which happened a lot later than when these first Europeans lived here. But the first Europeans still have many direct descendants in many parts of the world. So anyone who carries mtDNA beginning with U2E, U4 or U5, they are all directly descended from these first Europeans, these cave painters of Ice Age Europe, these who knew the last of the Neanderthals, actually. And we know this because these particular subclaves did originate among these people. So what may seem strange is that direct descendants of these first Europeans now belong to extremely different ethnic groups. If you consider this time scales, though, if you consider the time that has passed, this is not that strange, actually. Let us say that you have 3 sisters. I say sisters because we're now talking about maternal lines, mother lines, mitochondrial DNA. It is passed through from mother to daughter. So let us say you have 3 sisters, and one stays put where she was born, and her daughters also stay put. Now the second sister, she travels south, and she has daughters in the south. And the third sister travels north, and she has daughters in the north. Now generation after generation after generation pass, and thousands of years. Daughters of these 3 sisters who had the same mother, they keep marrying local men, and their languages change, their religions change, their cultures change, even their looks change, but their DNA, the mitochondrial DNA, still carry the same mitochondrial haplogroups, making it possible to trace them all back to the same origin, so far back in time that we cannot even imagine what languages they spoke or how they looked. This is more or less exactly what happened with the Aurignacians. Some remained in Iberia. Others moved south to northern Africa, actually, while others moved northeast towards what today is Finland, the Baltic, and Siberia. And only a few remained on the general European continent, blending into larger population groups whose ancestors had migrated into Europe much later. So, yeah, after the Aurignacians, several new waves of people began to enter Europe over time. And today, only an average of 4% of Europeans today still carry these distinctly European-born haplogroups. A larger percentage than this is only found in the Iberian Peninsula, that would be Spain and Portugal. In Spain and Portugal, you will find that as much as 11% carry these ancient haplogroups. But the Basque people of northern Spain, they are the only ones in southern Europe who may rightly call themselves direct descendants of these Aurignacians. Because, well, they, yeah, among the Basques, more than 40% of Basques are actually directly descended from Aurignacians. And the Basques also speak a language that is so different from other European languages that it is thought to have originated way, way, way back in time. Yeah. Now, a similar percentage of Aurignacian DNA is also found in northeastern Europe, especially among the Finnish and the Baltic populations, where we find an average of about 11%, just like in Iberia, just like in Portugal and Spain. We find 11% of direct descendants of Aurignacians, and these descend from Aurignacian people who migrated towards the northeast, and this must have happened at some point after the ice caps melted. Now, and here we also find something interesting. Just like the Basques are, possess a particularly much greater percentage of Aurignacian DNA, so also the Sami people of northern Scandinavia and northern Finland may boast, just like the Basques, of having between 40 and 50% of our Aurignacian maternal DNA. This is also found among several Siberian tribes, particularly the Uralic ones, among the Finno-Ugric tribes, and among the Samoyedic tribes. We find a lot of descendants of Aurignacians of the tundras who intermarried with people from the far east of Siberia. Even more interestingly, some Aurignacians even moved south, taking advantage of low sea levels to cross the Strait of Gibraltar, which sometimes have been like a land bridge between Europe and Africa. And today, more than 50% of maternal lineages among the North African tribes of Tuaregs and Berbers are directly descended also from these very first Europeans. Now, a new cultural peak of the same scale did not happen until some 30,000 years ago, and it was still the Ice Age. But these ancient Aurignacians who had ruled supreme in Europe for nearly 20,000 years in an unbroken and peaceful society, well, they were by now, by 30,000 years ago, after 20,000 years of glory, they were now slightly less tight-knitted than before, and they may have evolved already into several different tribes. Now, 30,000 years ago, they were finally encountered by new waves of migrants from the east of the Black Sea. Now, new people entered, distant relatives carrying the U7 and the U8 subclaves that are still relatively common in Eastern Europe, and among them a newcomer, the mtDNA haplogroup H for Helena. Their descendants are actually more common in Europe today than the descendants of the Aurignacians. As much as an average of 40% of Europeans today do carry this maternal lineage still. Now, around 33,000 years ago, this haplogroup H emerged south of the Caucasus to the east of the Black Sea, which is technically Western Asia, right by the border of Europe. From here, they spread into Europe and met with the old Aurignacians. However, they were Stone Age people. Their culture was not that different from the one they encountered in Europe. And they probably had no concept about continents or borders in the first place. They just happened to move further west than their ancestors had done. And then they met with other people, like they had always done. And as they had always done, they blended with the people they met. So these two ethnic groups met, and they mingled, and they mated, and they became as one. And a second European culture emerged to replace the former. And this is a culture that we know today as the Gravettian culture. And again, like the Aurignacian culture, the Gravettian culture was widely dispersed groups of hunter-gatherers who met up regularly and shared technology, and who lived a very similar lifestyle, and who shared a symbolic language. And the difference in this culture to the earlier one, the Gravettian versus the Aurignacian one, it's quite subtle actually. No real revolution happened. The art styles changed a little, but the themes were the same. Pregnant women, animals, abstract symbols, stick figure hunters, shamans. Their concerns in art and their lifestyles were more or less the same as it had been before. Now, the Gravettian culture also yielded enormous amounts of these so-called Venus figurines. They have left even more of them than the Aurignacians did. As you can see here, these Venus figures obviously represent a continuation of the old Aurignacian culture, which has spread across the entire Eurasian continent. And these figurines, this tradition was brought into the East by Siberian tribes who originated in Europe. And as we talked about before, we know that some of these Siberian tribes used such figurines into the modern age, which means that ethnographers have actually had a chance to learn what they may have meant to these Ice Age descendants. The Earth Mother, slash a representative of the tribe's ancestral mother, stuck into the ground at the center of the settlement to invoke game and to protect. The Gravettians are also responsible for the oldest known portraits, such as this one from Brassempoy in France. Now, this was found back in 1894. It's a beautiful portrait head of a woman, and it's probably one of the most famous works of Ice Age art because it really is a piece of art. It was made from ivory, from a mammoth tusk, and it is evidently an accomplished piece of sculpture. It was scraped and polished in outline, and the eyebrows, the nose and chin, they're all carved in relief, and the pupils in the eyes are actually marked by little holes. The hairstyle is very special, perhaps a sort of braiding or else a sort of hood. Among the other Gravettian figurines of pregnant women, we know the earliest known depiction of a cornucopia, a horn of plenty, the Venus of Locelle in France, a symbol well known in later European cultures as belonging to the goddess who provided everything, and also well known in Viking Age and Iron Age art in Scandinavia, where the horn carried by a woman represents the drink of memory, poetry, and wisdom. The Gravettian culture is also responsible for one of the most interesting Ice Age sites of Eastern Europe, Dolní Věstonice. This place is now situated in the Czech Republic, but back then it was all Ice Age tundra. And here is an artist image of how the site may have looked. At Dolní Věstonice, we find the very first examples of ceramics that we know of. 26,000 years ago, someone had discovered the art of making little figurines of animals from clay, and they had learned to make a ceramic oven to burn that clay. The very first ceramic Venus figurine was also found here, alongside small clay portraits of a woman with a distorted face, one of the other earliest examples of portraits from this age. Close to the settlement, a small grave was found, and it belonged to a woman with a facial condition. In fact, her face was all distorted, just as in these portraits, and she had been buried with ritual gear and appears to have been some sort of shaman. It seems obvious to me that the portraits show her, and maybe she was the one who actually invented the art of ceramics a long time before anyone thought about using them for making pots and pans. They were just used for making figures and portraits. Yeah. Also in Dolny Vestovnice, a very strange triple grave was found. Most Ice Age graves, they show that people were buried in a fetal position, as if death was perhaps perceived as going back into the womb of Earth before a new birth. And they would usually also be facing east towards the sunrise, which we could speculate to be another symbol of rebirth, a new sun. Also, they were usually buried on their own, but in this grave, two large men had been buried on either side of a woman, or so we thought. Recent DNA studies have shown that the one who had been buried in the middle actually turned out to be a small, slender man. And he was laying on his back, and his crotch had been covered with red ochre, which was common enough. Covering bodies with red ochre was common, but the hand of one of the men lying on his side was placed right there, as if embracing the small man and reaching out towards his red-colored crotch. And the third man was buried face down, which was unusual. They have absolutely no way of knowing why they were buried like this, and we may only wonder at what drama may have unfolded to make them all die and be buried at the same time in this unusual symbolic way. Anyway, the Gravettian culture was replaced by a third European culture, and it was connected to another migration into Europe. This third migration into Europe probably began to happen about 17,000 years ago. Now, there was still no Scandinavia, still no Northern Europe. It was all covered in ice. And it does not need to have been a migration wave in the sense that we today think of it. The people who lived back then would have covered vast areas of space during a lifetime because they were nomadic. And some groups may have moved west, and their descendants may have had the fortune of multiplying so well that they contributed to the general European gene pool. Now, before this time, we have almost only found examples of the haplogroups U2, U4, U5, and U8, followed by the later H group from the east. But now a significant number of new blood was introduced, telling us yet another input, yet another new input of mothers from the east. Also in the Y DNA, that is the father lineage, we also find new input from the east. So these new peoples, they blended with the old people in Europe and merged into a new and third great European Ice Age culture. And we call this culture the Magdalenian culture. It flourished for another incredible 5,000 years. And it would probably have continued to flourish had there not been a dramatic climate change. You see, the world began to change 10,000 BC, 12,000 years ago, because the Ice Age came to an end and the ice caps began to recede. And this caused tremendous changes in climate and tremendous changes for the people who lived back then. So I'm not going to talk about that part yet, not in this video, because I'm focusing on the Ice Age now. Anyway, the Magdalenians. The Magdalenians were actually closely related to a smaller culture group that had developed in the west of France. It's a group we refer to as the Solutreans, and they are famous for creating a very distinct new type of spearheads. The Solutreans may have also been, they may have been descendants of these earliest populations of Europe, and there is some evidence for them having even been able to move across the Atlantic by following the ice caps by boat west. And we think so because some of these very particular spearheads have been found on the east coast of America. Now, well, before anyone goes to say all Europeans discovered America first, please do remember that these Europeans were not the same as the ones who came to America later. These were Ice Age, Stone Age people who lived like Ice Age, Stone Age people. They would have been exactly the same as Native Americans of the time. They were genetically related to the Sami, to the Basques, to the Tuaregs, and the Samoyedic people. So they probably had no idea that they had come to a previously unsettled continent either. But they probably went there. People got around a lot. Now, the Magdalenians, they were genetically much more diverse than their European predecessors, but culture-wise, there appears to have been a continuation in the use of symbols and art as well as location. So the differences to the earlier Gravettian and Aurignacian cultures are subtle. But the Magdalenians were much more into stylized and abstract art than the people who came before them. As you can see from these Venus figurines, they are less naturalistic and more abstract, and they look more and more like the goddess figurines that came with later Neolithic peoples. So, yeah, and other cultural differences were, well, they had more technical innovations actually, and they domesticated the dog. Otherwise, the lifestyle was as before: hunting, gathering, nomadic life. It was the order of the day. The Magdalenian culture was responsible for the famous cave art of Lascaux in France and Altamira in Spain. And this is also the culture that most Europeans are descended from on the mother-to-daughter side of things. Why? Because later migrations appear to have brought more men than women, which means that the European father lines today are often from much more recent inputs from the East, inputs happening a long time after the ice caps had melted, a long time after the time period that we talk about. And it is also a result of men suddenly migrating more than women for some reason. Somehow, over time, these male lineages from the East that came in quite late into Europe, they have been replacing the ancient Ice Age descended male populations of Europe. While the mother lines, interestingly, have often maintained their early Ice Age European ancestry. But back in Magdalenian times, men and women still share the same ancestry. They were partly descended from the earlier European cultures and partly descended from people who had moved in slowly from Western Asia and the Middle East. From the east of the Caucasus Mountains. As to culture, the Magdalenians shared more with the earlier Gravettians and Aurignacians than they didn't. They loved to draw, carve and sculpt images of fertile women and animal life, alongside a symbolic system of abstract signs, and they painted in caves and lived from hunting and gathering. So, yeah, much similar to the past, but also different. Something had happened in their style, basically. They were more abstract. We cannot know much about their myths or beliefs of their gods, but we know that the stylized image of the fat, pregnant, nursing woman remains central to all these early European cultures, and actually this concern was not even nowhere near its peak yet. So, shamanism, that shamanism was an integral part of their culture too is certain. The art of calling spirits of nature and spirits of the ancestors, the gods and other beings. The art of traveling outside of the body in other worlds or in the shape of the animals, using song, dance, rattles, staffs and drums in order to reach a state of heightened awareness in which such invocations or journeys became possible. It was all the same. The Magdalenian culture may have experienced new technology and a different, more stylized sort of art than before, but otherwise their culture simply appears to have been a continuation again of the age-old shamanistic hunter-gatherer traditions, with their obsession for the fertile woman, who may have been the earliest of goddesses. And despite many changes to come, these ancient elements of shamanism, earth mother and ancestral mother worship, and the memories of a time when more than one type of human existed and roamed the earth together, all these ancient elements of Ice Age Europe were integrated and survived somehow into the much later cultures that existed in Europe, and among them the culture that we know as the Old Norse. Thank you for today.